Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Carlson, and I'm the head of the Serials Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And on behalf of the NASIG Continuing Education Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our March webinar, the NASIG Digital Preservation webinar on integrating preservation into librarian workflows, presented by Jill Emery and Sunshine Carter, and moderated by Michelle Polchow. Before this presentation, I have a few quick announcements. First, the webinar will be recorded, and I just hit record. And anyone who registered for the webinar will receive a link to this recording via email shortly, probably over the next couple days. Second, if you have any questions for the presenters during the presentation, please enter them into the question and answer box, and we'll go over the questions at the end. And finally, when the webinar is over, please follow the survey link that we will place in the chat box, or actually, I think you will receive it later. I hope that you will take a few minutes to fill it out to see how we're doing and let us know how we can do better. And if you have any ideas for any other webinars. And now I turn it over to our moderator, Michelle.
Thanks, Amy. Today, we're very excited to present the Integrating Preservation into Librarian Workflows webinar. As you know, electronic resource management has many essential steps, whether the resources being managed are OA, subscription, or a hybrid. And one of the lesser understood topics is the need to consider preservation, which has two aspects of access. First, there's a long-term preservation of content to ensure digital scholarly content in all formats remains available to future users. The second aspect of importance for librarians is understanding post-cancellation access, as this facilitates ongoing use by local community users. The NASIG Digital Preservation Committee is honored to have both Jill Emery and Sunshine Carter with us this afternoon to share insights from their work concerning techniques and considerations for integrating preservation into librarian workflows. First, let me introduce Jill. Jill Emery is the Collection Development and Management Librarian at Portland State University Library and has over 20 years of academic library experience. She's held leadership positions in ALA ALCTS, ER&L, and NASIG. She serves on the Project Counter Executive Committee and is a member of the editorial boards for the Charleston Advisor, Collaborative Librarianship, and Insights, the UKSG journal. She's also a columnist on Heard on the Net for the Charleston Advisor and has co-authored the book Techniques for Electronic Resource Management Terms and the Transition to Open. Sunshine Carter is currently the Director for Collection Strategies and E-Resource Management at the University of Minnesota on the Twin Cities campus. She's been an electronic resources librarian since 2005 in various capacities at both the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and Duluth campuses. And among her many contributions made to the electronic resource management profession, she's a contributing author to the book Reengineering the Library, Issues in Electronic Resource Management. She received her MLS from the University of California, Los Angeles. So we're delighted to have you both here with us today, and let me turn things over to Jill to get us started.
Thank you, Michelle. All right. I can figure out how to advance my slides. This is always the problem. Hold on. Here we go. So I'm starting with background and where to start with preservation work. First off, we need to define locally what is meant by preservation. And it is helpful to have this conversation at your institution with the stakeholders that you have both within the library and without the library and outside of the library, to determine what it is you want to preserve and how you want to preserve it. NASIG has been working on drafting a digital preservation policy, and that might be a good place to start with indicating how you want to define preservation at your institution and what it means to you. one of the things I want to point out, because I see this happen a lot in library Twitter and other places, is there's this convolution all the time of a preservation strategy equaling local ownership. And I'm not sure that that necessarily needs to be wedded together. I think we need to think long and hard about what we're going to support as third-party or sort of external preservation strategies that we support as libraries that might be worthwhile and sustainable to us. So I think that's a point of conversation that every institution kind of needs to have in and among its own librarians. And a preservation strategy can be and can incorporate the maintenance of or ready access to print resources, and that we shouldn't discount print as not having a role to play in our consideration of what we're doing as far as preservation. It is a key component of our collection strategies. And for this reason, it really should be incorporated into whatever your collection documentation may be, whether it's a collection development policy, your plan, priorities, or strategies. Sitting down, as I noted before, and having a conversation with the key stakeholders, both within the library and external to the library on your campus, for instance, is really important and indicative to helping to develop what the preservation strategy overall should be for your academic library. And I will say, throughout this conversation, I'm really referring to academic libraries and less so to public libraries, special libraries, and other specialized libraries. So why does preservation matter with electronic resources? It really helps us to determine, or should help us determine, what our retention is at the point of selection. It's definitely a key component that can be used in vendor negotiations and is starting to become more and more important in that regard, which I'll cover in a second. We also need to do a better job, I think, overall as a community of how to capture the necessary metadata at the point of purchase and making sure that we fully understand what our preservation mechanisms are from the moment of making resources available to our constituents. It does help determine how then that resource is implemented, whether it just ends up in a LibGuide, whether it ends up on an A to Z list, whether it ends up in the catalog. All of these attributes can be part of what the preservation strategy is behind a given resource. It also helps determine how much time and effort should be applied to troubleshooting problems that occur with any resource. It determines how a resource will be assessed and what you're really looking for, especially when you're making one-time purchases, one-time buys. You're probably not having to look at cost per use to the same extent you would be with current subscriptions and current cost resources. And it also provides the needed information to determine what is your long-term and short-term availability of resources. So the way I chose to organize my thoughts, or my section of this, is to go through the different aspects of the techniques for electronic resources and look at what the preservation issues are for each one of those. So in looking at the preservation component of investigating new content, by determining upfront what your preservation strategy is for any given content that you're reviewing determines really how extensively you might want to review it at your initial selection. You might want to spend more time with primary source material and one-time purchase material that is going to be with you for an extended period of time. That might mean having a longer trial or a longer review period for that content. Whereas with other resources, you might not need to do any review at all, but you do want to know whether you're choosing post-cancellation rights for journals or books at the point of order. In regards to streaming media, we generally are not at this point really looking at long-term capturing of that material, in part because we just don't have that availability to us. So, you know, it might be something that you just need to supply for a short term for a class that's being offered in a given semester or a given term. And it doesn't need to be something that's sustained in the long term. And I think in regards to open access, especially with open access ebooks, is reviewing how many times it's repeated on different websites or hosted in different places could mean that the longevity of the resource will tend to be around a lot further than if it's just hosted one place or one area. In looking at the purchasing and licensing, determining what your perpetual access rights are and what you want your perpetual rights are become a key negotiation factor. You definitely want to make sure you are negotiating for perpetual access where you want it and where you think it makes the most sense. However, you can potentially negotiate better costs or service terms by giving up perpetual access. So it's one of the things to consider and to ask when you're doing a negotiation, especially for any sort of journal bundle, if you're giving up post-cancellation rights, what does that achieve for you and what does that get you that goes beyond that sort of aspect of what it would cost for that perpetual maintenance? You want to make sure that it's definitely fully delineated in the license and to what extent it's delineated. You want it to be for your favorable perpetual access rights and not be that you're going to get a CD-ROM or a hard drive or a flash drive, which Sunshine is going to talk about further in her presentation. You want to ensure that you are getting machine readable files and not just something that you would have to place somewhere else. You want to look at whether there is the use of clocks or the keeper's registry from ISSN or Portico upon cessation, and maybe having that third-party presentation of the content works for you, and that you don't need to have any sort of local solution for collecting things with perpetual rights that you then end up hosting in some way. And you want to ensure that cancellation doesn't mean that you lose access for years paid, especially with databases and ANI resources, because they tend to be the trickier resources where you have problems with that sort of consideration. At the point of implementation, the real necessity is recording the metadata that really encapsulates what the perpetual access rights. And it really helps to use your library management systems to your advantage to designate and retain what these rights are. Indicating also if there are not retention rights due to a negotiation tactic is equally important. So it should be not just about recording what your rights are, but what your rights may not be. Indicating what the unknown retention rights are in regards to open access titles, I think is really valid as well. Because you want to know if there is the potential of that resource still being available or not. Indicating the third-party preservation portals, as noted before, clocks, keeper's registry, Portico, again, is important. Indicating when there's backfile purchases made with the same provider that might be providing current access is also important to note. I'd also recommend considering noting print preservation. If you're a member of WEST or BTAA's collective collection or East or Rosemont, any of these strategies, it might be important to indicate that there is this preservation copy out there in the academic realm already, which might make it less important to you to maintain that content locally if you need to, because you do have ready access through one of these print preservation strategies. And one of the techniques that we've started using at Portland State with streaming media is putting in public display in our linking convention of what the length of access is for any given film that we have available, that we've licensed. This helps the instructor know what the timeframes are from when they can use streaming media content and when it might be going away. In regards to troubleshooting resources, by having the post-cancellation rights recorded somewhere in your library management system, allows you to determine most readily what your holding entitlements are. And this is often a big question that comes up with troubleshooting, is do I really have access to this? And being able to readily pull up that information and have that information available to a wide swath of library staff is critically important when trying to help patrons get access to content. Again, with streaming media, many of the access problems arise because the length of access has already been expended and the patron doesn't know that. Maybe the subject librarian doesn't know that. So it's really important to have that really visibly available so that people understand the length of content, the length of time content is made available. And then understanding what really happens with open access. You know, we know in many cases that articles become open access after a certain embargo period, usually 12 months, according to funder regulations with our federal government. But in some cases, publishers are now putting out sort of teasers or early content releases, making content open access, but then moving it back behind the paywall. Knowing which publishers and which providers are doing this, again, is really important when you're trying to find out whether you really have access to that content or not. And I highly recommend checking the Keeper's Registry and clocks to see if there is an access point that you may have missed for any given journal article in particular, or journal title that you might be looking for when trying to help patrons get to material. In determining the assessment and what's needed, the one attribute of Counter 5 that I think is really important, and one of the ways we wanted to make it extensible to people, is to allow to look at usage of content that was purchased previously or in the past, as opposed to just current usage, and being able to evaluate what usage that content is getting. In part because this does help with determining what backfile purchases you may want to make with ebooks or e-journals. It also helps in determining what sort of third-party strategy, preservation strategy you may want to support, and you may want to make sure you're helping succeed and be sustainable going forward. And when past usage is cross-checked with authorship production, it can indicate where sort of backflipping of OA content might be helpful. By backflipping, what we mean is using the negotiation strategy of negotiating a contract with the journal provider where maybe you don't have current APC breaks or cost funding given to your institution, but what you do get is articles that your patrons or faculty authored being made open access after a certain time frame. And this is becoming a negotiation strategy that NERL has engaged in, as well as some of the Texas libraries. And so it's something to consider. And one of the ways that knowing what past usage has been is really important. In regards to sustainability, knowing what content is retained is really crucial when you're looking at the cancellation of resources and determining what you can and can't cancel, and what you will continue to have access to going forward. It also helps in determining what your local preservation strategies are. Do you want to have a dedicated server where you can collect and host local content that you want to make sure you have available? Some bigger institutions, again, are taking this strategy and running with it. It's not a strategy that many institutions can really afford to do and sustain in any given way. But it also might help determine a regional preservation participation and where you want to join in. If you know what you are collecting locally, it helps you determine what works best with those regional preservation strategies. And it can also aid in determination of even the print preservation initiatives such as West and East and BTAA again, and HathiTrust. You know, if you're collecting certain things and you know you're going to keep those in your print collection, that might be impetus to joining these larger initiatives so that you help bring unique content to them. It can also aid in determination if you want to participate in the third-party preservation portals, as mentioned before. And in the future, it can also help with developing and understanding what level you want to play with controlled digital lending, because you know what you have and what you want to make available from your electronic resources or collection resources. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Sunshine.
Thanks, Jill. I'm assuming you can hear me all okay. Yes. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk about the ways in which Minnesota works on the preservation of our, mostly our post-cancellation access that we've negotiated into our contracts. My role at the University of Minnesota Libraries in the Twin Cities is as the Director of Collection Strategy and E-Resource Management. And so we work as a group, as a unit, to ensure that our licenses contain post-cancellation access rights for the majority of the serials and the monographs that we purchase, in addition to other primary source materials that we're getting. And while my area primarily focuses on collection strategy, the collections budget, and in addition, all of the e-resource management, we do work closely with many other areas in the library, such as preservation, such as interlibrary loan. And so we work very closely and talk a lot about these aspects, along with metadata and cataloging. And so it's a cast of thousands, hundreds in our libraries at Minnesota. Next slide, please. So just as to provide a little bit of context about the University of Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, we're a large R1 land grant university, and we are the only R1 institution. We have a lot of students, faculty, staff, a lot of content that's both print and electronic, and we have a lot of staff that wear a lot of different hats, but we're able to focus our staff into very specific areas and responsibilities, which is very helpful when trying to kind of track down some of this information that we're attempting to gather for our perpetual access information. We are a part of a system, and we have system campuses in Duluth, Crookston, Morris, and Rochester as well. And we have had a lot of discussions about post-cancellation access. And I am no expert, we are no experts, and really this, the stuff that I'm going to talk to you today about is a little bit about our journey, tales from the crypt. I like to joke about, to really just give examples of what an institution is doing in terms of discussion and actions to take in terms of preservation. So next slide, please. First, I wanted to call out these really great quotes that were in Terms 2.0 that Jill was talking about, that really resonated with me as I was just kind of reviewing that prior to our session today. That the first is that it's not just a technology issue, but a commitment of resources over time. And ultimately, preservation is a series of decisions. And this is so true. Really, the commitment to preservation takes a lot of voices and policies and processes that all need to work together. And yes, you need technology to do some of this stuff, but you need to have a lot of conversations. And this second quote, the preoccupation with immediate access of information has subsequently resulted in the neglect of sustainable preservation practices. And I have to say that we are not immune to that ourselves. This need to fulfill access for our users sometimes puts aside these conversations about sustainable preservation practices. And even when you have the best of intentions, you have a big budget, you have a lot of people, these still are issues that we face as well. Next slide, please. And so I have surprisingly done a few talks, more talks than I thought about post-cancellation access, and an article in Against the Grain with a colleague of mine. And this was a gift that I used in one of my first talks about post-cancellation access, the post-cancellation access problem. And I am a Buffy fan, and I think this GIF is perfectly suited to post-cancellation access, is that we're all kind of aware that this is potentially an issue, and that maybe we think everything will turn out fine in the end. And maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I think there's sometimes a little bit of magical thinking about our expectations of how our preservation will turn out on these commercially published content that we're subscribing to. So we're not perfect in Minnesota, far from actually having any kind of real plan, but we're much further along than we were 8 years ago. So next slide, please. We have at Minnesota, our highest interest in ensuring post-cancellation access right are our journals and our ebooks, to mimic what our print journals and ebooks were doing on the shelf. So we have the most interest in ensuring that we have preservation rights for our journals and ebooks. Lower interest in our aggregated content. It's too difficult really to monitor and track that, and least content, of course. We have a lot of concern about other types of resources, which would be the data sets, the streaming media, just kind of the ephemera that's out there that we haven't really focused on it at Minnesota. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through a few projects and activities and discussions that we have had, and what the ideal situation would be, where it stands at Minnesota. I have linked to the preservations or papers where I've gone into more detail of this, and then hopefully this is not a self-citation situation, but since I was asked to talk about Minnesota's experience, I have links to kind of the fuller story if you are interested in looking at some of these. We have been talking about post-cancellation access rights for a very long time. And we, as I mentioned, attempt to negotiate all of the rights that we can for our journals and our books, ebooks. We have, however, many flavors of post-cancellation access rights. And I've talked a little bit with some of our folks in the libraries about whether we should be grading the level of access to kind of quickly code or search for various types of post-cancellation access. But all of our contracts attempt to either have post-cancellation through third parties, such as Portico. We know that some of our post-cancellation access will be delivered to us on a drive. Vendor hosted is our preferred, but sometimes those come with fees, and I would say could be disappear if a vendor is taken over or goes under. And we have a few contracts that have rolling post-cancellation access, which is that you only get post-cancellation access for 5 years, and then after that it disappears. So that certainly is a very odd and not common right, but it does exist. Next slide, please. Here's an example of post-cancellation access rights that we received for one of our canceled journals. And this was a teaching professor. And yes, I still have this jump drive in this envelope. We have since done something with this content, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But this is something that's unsustainable for us. If we want to cancel our resources, we need to have an easy way to not only to store if necessary, but definitely to deliver content to our users. Next slide, please. So we have been on a quest to record our post-cancellation access entitlements. We have been attempting to do a deduplication in our libraries of serials and determining whether something is deemed as a surrogate or not has been taking a long time for us to do. And so we have been, since the improvement to ALMA and the enhancement that was done to allow for the specific recording of post-cancellation access rights, the specific dates, we have been taking advantage of that and slowly adding information where we can. And so we call this PCAD, post-cancellation access determination. That's a long-term project that we have. We've been using order records, vendor entitlement reports, and then we enter that information in. And my colleague and I, Yumiko Toyota Kindler, wrote an article for Against the Grain, and you can find out more about how we've been doing that. But this is something that everyone should consider doing. It's a daunting task, but one I think with a lot of benefits in the end. Next slide, please. I also get a lot of questions from acquisition staff about whether or not an open access journal is actually providing post-cancellation access and how it is being preserved. So even if you are embarking on supporting open access, whether that's subscribed to open or which I think most of the questions come to me regarding subscribe to open journals, I think, or read and publish. I think it's really important to have these conversations and figure out how to record these into your post-cancellation access entitlement records as well. It's not always clear, and we like to know exactly where and how we will get our entitlements. And there's, we've received some responses from some publishers that like, well, it's open. Yes, you will always have access. And that has been difficult to try and pin down exactly where our long-term preservation access will come from if the journal ceases to exist. Next slide, please. This print serials withdrawal that I mentioned really was reliant on that post-cancellation access determination, or PCAD. And we have a lot of talented individuals who've been helping work and write scripts to kind of do an automated checking of whether or not our post-cancellation access coverage overlaps with our print coverage, and also attempts to look at title changes along the way. And after that's all said and done, what we're really trying to do is determine a confidence level of preservation that would allow us to withdraw the print titles. And so we look at both coverage of a serial in our shared print repository held at the Big Ten Academic Alliance. We look at portico preservation, and we also look at our post-cancellation access rights. We don't really look at that level of post-cancellation or the grading that I mentioned earlier, but we do look to see if we have any, and then also whether or not those rights come with ILL rights as well. That's important to us too. So we have had several phases of this project and continue to do it on a regular basis, and are hoping someday to, rather than having to rely on the script, use the post-cancellation access in ALMA to kind of drive the overlap analysis of print to E. So next slide, please. I mentioned the jump drive that we receive with our post-cancellation access rights. And we have implemented a Band-Aid solution, and I continue to call it a Band-Aid because that's exactly what it is. It's a temporary solution, and we are continuing to use Google Drive to store and preserve, and I'm using preserve with some air quotes here, and then deliver the content. It is not seamless access for our users. It's staff-mediated delivery. We have added some portfolios in ALMA for those titles that then allow someone to request the article through Interlibrary Loan. Interlibrary Loan staff get those requests, go into Google Drive, find the content, and deliver it to the user. And the reason we can't use Google Drive authentication to deliver content seamlessly is because our access for Google Suites is not just our current students, faculty, and staff. So because it includes alumni, because it includes sponsored accounts, other people of interest, parents, we are unable to deliver our content seamlessly through Google Drive. So we get permission from the vendor, we host it in Google Drive and deliver it, and there is no preservation, real preservation in there at all. Next slide, please. We have also been experimenting with digital site licenses, which allows us to buy the rights to host and stream a multimedia, typically streaming video. It allows us to host that on our own servers. And we really have limited capacity to deliver this content securely. We can upload it, the content, rip it, or get the files and deliver it to classes who have requested the content via Kaltura and Canvas. But we have been having some issues with IP version 6 with our hosting platforms. And since we have a mix of IP ranges on our campus, we are having some issues delivering the content with a user who has an IP version 6 IP address. So again, we're just delivering access to this, and it's really our highest priority. There's no preservation, but we really want to think about how preservation of this content can substitute for a physical DVD, which is not something we want to continue to buy. So we need to think a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. I think it's important to share that this is something that I've been talking about for a long time. Our capacity to have a server or storage or people who are going to be working on the metadata for any kind of preserved content is limited. And my hope is that someday we have a better holistic plan on how to handle preserving our purchased e-resource content. I think this year, as we plan for our fiscal year 23 goals, we have made the most progress in getting this topic on a list of things to do for the next fiscal year. And I feel optimistic. We will be hopefully discussing with many people at the table what our needs are, the gaps, costs. Should we have an investigatory group who looks into this? And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to at least have a small pressy or white paper internally that talks about the real needs and the hidden costs of not having a robust preservation system, the inability to cancel resources, the inability to withdraw print because we can't trust our own preservation, or even whether or not we consider an ebook to be a surrogate for a print book in certain circumstances. So this is on the horizon, so I'm very excited about our future for ensuring preservation in our purchased e-resources. And I think that is all from me. I'll turn it over to our moderator.
Alrighty. Thank you, Sunshine and Jill. That was excellent. I think that as our audience is considering submitting questions through the Q&A box, let me get started with asking Sunshine about more about ALMA's capability to enter the post cancellation. And is that part of the portfolio, or is that part of the licensing mechanism in ALMA, which is a little technical? But...
Yeah. So you can record post cancellation access at in different aspects in the license and in the portfolio and in the collection. The license, of course, you can indicate whether or not you have the rights or not. You can enter in text from the license. You can also add your own custom license fields, which would be helpful. if you want to be able to pull out specific license clauses there. In the collections and the portfolios, the portfolio level, which is the title level access point for those who don't use ALMA, that is where you would indicate if the collection provides, if you've indicated that the collection provides post-cancellation access determination, then you would be able to enter in a coverage date of that post-cancellation access. So that is where you would record the specific year, volume, issue for your post-cancellation access. That information you can then pull out via ALMA Analytics and get reports. And it looks like a coverage statement similar to access availability in ALMA. So it looks very similar, but it's a different column of data when you pull it out. So does that answer your question, Michelle?
Yeah, definitely. And I might have a follow-up question, but I see we have another question from the audience. Thank you, Sunshine, for talking about print withdrawal in conjunction with digital preservation. Have you successfully withdrawn print volumes against e-journal entitlements, PCA, or e-journal preservation commitments? Or is it mostly withdrawn knowing an organization such as BTAA is keeping a print copy for the consortia? Thanks.
Yes, so we have withdrawn serials based on our PCAD project, and all three of those criteria that I mentioned have to have been met in order for us to withdraw a serial. So held in the Big Ten shared print repository, in Portico, and preserved for the dates that's on the shelf for us. And we have post-cancellation access rights that come with ILL rights. So all three of those need to have been met. So it's pretty conservative. And then we're able to withdraw. When we started the project, we wanted to ensure that what was on the shelf was covered 100% by print shared repository, Portico, and our post-cancellation access. We're getting to the point where we want to loosen that up a little bit, and maybe maybe we're comfortable with like 80% coverage overlap because we're desperate for space. And I was telling Jill this in one of our meetings before, is that the comfort level with perpetual access, post-cancellation access, the comfort level has increased amongst administrators, and reliance on that as an actual thing that exists as the space crunch grows. And so whereas we maybe 8 years ago, like no one thought an ebook would equal a surrogate to a print book, we're now going to probably have discussions about that. So we do record I should say commitments for retaining. We are recording some of those commitments in our in ALMA, or we have lists. So when we're looking at a title for withdrawal, it also can't be a title that we're committed to hold. So we are cross-checking those against that. And hopefully that answers your question, Shannon.
Well, as moderator, can I take up question time? This seems like a huge project, and maybe you and Jill can weigh in on tackling license terms and doing the homework for, you know, do we have ILL rights and all of that? Was there a starting place that made sense, that you had like one particular collection of journals that you were thinking of canceling? And so that's where that got you started? Or is there kind of a, how do you bite off the first chunk of this?
Jill, do you want to do that, or I can start us off? You're muted and you're.
I'll let you start us off and jump in.
Okay. I think the starting point for us really was to attempt to get a list of we have not really, I think a cancellation is very difficult. It's a tricky thing for us to navigate, especially with bigger deals. I would say we don't have a lot of big deals at Minnesota, but we have bigger deals. Well, maybe those are not the right words to use. With less than big deals is what we have. So we definitely, I think, have difficulty canceling without knowing how we're going to be getting our post-cancellation access. But this project really started with trying to free up space because of our assessment of our space and being over capacity. And how we started out originally was drawing from a list of what are the collections that we believe, Alma believes that we have post-cancellation access, and also that have these ILL rights. And in some ways, that was an automated process of sorts. And then what we did is we have these scripts. We pulled data from shared print, we pulled data from Portico, and these scripts run through and tried to compare, the dates. The holding dates on print records just make it very difficult to do this. And it's just, unfortunate that, it's just the beast of metadata and trying to wrangle it all. So we first started doing deduplication / weeding / withdrawal of print by taking the collections that we knew we had perpetual access to a starting point. So we have several contracts where if a title is added to our less than a big deal, we let's say 1995 onward, like these are easy collections to start with. So we started with the collections where we knew the most and had to do the least amount of metadata management, because we didn't have to look at each title. When did we buy it? When did our access start? There are some publishers that will give you PCA from when you had a print order. So it's very intensive, eyes-on, hands-on process. And so if you have collections where concrete dates without having to dig into each title, and you're looking to withdraw content, like I would say that's the easiest place to start. I'm going to step out and get some water real quick while Jill says something.
Well, I agree with Sunshine, and we have also done some print journal collection reduction. Very similar, we are members of West, and so we look at what the West holdings are, and then what our backfile access may or may not be. In some cases, we have made strategic backfile purchases, which is relying then on third-party access, but we are not an R1 institution, we're an R2, and so we're not as wedded to feeling like we have to retain content beyond our West obligations at this juncture. And then we were also evaluating or looking at what our post-cancellation access would be. These tended to be our focus was to do it by call number range, as opposed to looking at a specific publisher or specific collection initially. And then we flipped to looking at where we had JSTOR coverage in addition to West Holdings, since West was initially created to really ensure that there was print coverage of a number of the titles that were in JSTOR. That was a good melding point for us to determine what our print retention should be.
I will also mention, and I'll put a link in the chat, that there was a local Minnesota eResources Minnesota conference in January, and there was a presentation by the staff at the Minnesota State University Mankato about recording PCA in ALMA, and I'll put a link in the chat to that, and the recording is there. It's very interesting, especially if you're not an R1 institution, which is just an unmanageable situation in terms of tracking down post-cancellation access. I think they have a very nice recording, and you can contact them if you have any questions.
Perfect. Well, I think, great, we've got that sent out in chat. And I think last call for any other questions. If not, I just want to really express our appreciation today to getting this conversation started, for Jill and Sunshine being pioneers in the ability to think strategically ahead for where libraries do have gaps and can support each other in sharing information. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much. And turn it over to Amy. If I think Amy said that there would be a follow-up for evaluation.
Actually, I think that I read my script, and I think that the survey actually comes out with a follow-up email. So so I apologize about that. As I was reading it, I thought, oh, I'm not sure about that. Anyway, so I will try to send it out with the follow-up email. And I want to thank you all today. Thank you so much for the speakers. Thank you so much to the attendees, and I just very much appreciate everybody's time today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you.